Statement begins. If you had to organize every person on Earth by their fear, how would you do it? It's obvious that it would be a huge undertaking. There's so many people on Earth with so many different perspectives. Is it really possible that there's enough overlap between roughly 8 billion people to sort everyone into a few categories? Well, according to the Magnus Archives, yes, pretty definitively. The Magnus Archives, in case you didn't see my last video, is a horror tragedy podcast about a place called the Magnus Institute and the archival team working within. While the new head archivist, Jonathan Sims, first believes the place to be a poorly organized mess of paranoid fantasies and obvious hoaxes, it soon becomes clear to him and his associates that something much deeper is at play. If you haven't listened to the Magnus Archives and that little blurb sounded interesting to you, this is your chance to pause the video, leave a like, subscribe, and listen to the show. It's only 200 episodes, but it's pretty worth it. It's one of those things that are great on your first and second listen. The first time, you're hit with the atmosphere and left in the dark about what's actually going on until later in the show, and the second time, you get to re-enjoy your favorite stories with a greater understanding of why they actually happened. It's awesome, but unfortunately, I'm going to be talking about some of the later game stuff in this video, so if you don't want to lose the opportunity to experience the reveals yourself, now's the time to get the freak out of here. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Magnus Archives podcast has a specific way of sorting every single person into a category based on their fear. Essentially, there are 15 entities, these crazy eldritch beings that exist in a space separate but close to us. It's very Lovecraft. Each of these entities relates to a general fear that someone might have. In the Magnus Archives, you can expect pretty much every recounted story to focus on one or two specific fears at a time. It can either be a first-hand account of something strange that happened to someone, which can be attributed to an entity, or an encounter with something called an avatar, a more physical, usually mortal character who acts in service of, or as an extension of, any given entity. In a literary sense, it's a great framework for writing. You choose one of the 15 entities listed and explore an aspect of their associated fear. In a story sense, though, there's a deeper meaning to it. Like any good horror antagonist, the entities feed off their specific fears, and so the fact that there are 15 of them implies that that's how many actual general fears there can be. So consider this an instructional video. I'll be going through each fear, explaining what they mean and giving you an example of when you might feel such a fear. Next time your blood runs cold and you feel an icy chill run up your back, think back to this video. It might help you fight back against the entity you're battling. But honestly, it probably won't. A quick warning. I'm focusing primarily on describing uncomfortable and potentially upsetting scenarios in this video, so if you're sensitive to stuff like that, this video could be worth skipping. The name of each fear will pop up before I discuss it, so you can also just skip the ones you're specifically uncomfortable with if that's better for you. But without any further ado, let's talk about what we're afraid of. The buried refers to all the fears you might have about shit being around you. You scared about being buried alive? Well, that one's obvious, but are you afraid of drowning? That's basically being buried in water. If you're claustrophobic, this is you, buddy. It's uncomfortable having such little space around you. Did you ever get trapped somewhere playing hide and seek? Feel your shoulders get stuck in an awkward way, so you couldn't pull yourself out of some crawl space that you managed to worm into? That dread, that sudden rush of panic as you realize you were trapped with nowhere to go? It's agonizing. I think of those pictures you see of people caving, deep underground in these horrifically tight rocky passageways. Their arms are pinned to their sides, their back is practically pressed up against the ceiling. Some people do that all the time. Some people do that alone. It's crazy. Whenever you see those photos, it's almost like you forget about the flash of the camera. You see the lights on their heads and the stone caught in the flash behind it, and you can almost convince yourself there's a dim light in that cave, that somehow the light of the surface has crept in, a lifeline of direction and warmth, but then you remember. All these tight passageways, barely open through centuries of erosion, jagged and zigzagging back and forth deeper into the earth, and it hits you. There's no such thing as natural light in this place. There never has been. If something went wrong, if the lights went out, that would be it. Swallowed by the earth. We take for granted screaming in space. Of course no one could hear you. Nothing lives in space, but trapped under the crust of the earth, beneath the footsteps of your fellow man, it is that much more terrifying to know you will not be heard. That like every other part of you, the desperate noise you make will be buried, no matter how raw you scream your throat. Coffin or cavern, the earth takes you. The buried takes you. You bite into an apple. It is sweet and juicy and crisp and... What? There was a soft bit. What was that? What was in your apple? Oh my... What was in your apple? You spit a chunk of chewed up fruit into the sink and look down. Tiny white maggots crawl through the rotten fruit. Horrified, you glance at the apple in your hand. From your bite spills a fountain of insect, chittering, squirming maggots, multi-legged, multi-eyed bugs spewing their rotten liquids and crawling, churning in your hand, a miasma of corruption. This is why we have pesticides. A concept which has always been really interesting to me is the idea of morality as it applies to terror. Are termites evil because they destroy people's houses? Well, no, they're just eating. They're literally trying to survive and don't know the difference between wood people live in and wood people don't. You can argue that some bugs are evil, like wasps or mosquitoes, but even then, those awful insects are only awful because that's the way their own survival works, their necessary food source or defense mechanism. Evil is a purely human concept because humans are one of the only species that have that level of control over their pattern recognition and social interactions. A bug is never trying to take advantage of you, not knowingly of course, and that brings us to my main point here. If you were, say, tortured by a serial killer, you would be able to recognize that the choice to inflict pain on you was actively made, and as much as it sucks to be in your position, there is a potential to understand at least the circumstances that placed you in that situation. You can rationalize mental illness or anger, and even if it's unlikely, the fact that you're dealing with another human means that there's at least some hope of reasoning with them, of appealing to something within their consciousness. But when you have an infection or a parasite, when you're being tortured by a being you cannot communicate with, there's nothing to do. Sure, we have treatment options, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about intention. Something which hurts you as a byproduct of its own existence, something which can't be communicated or pleaded with, that digs and corrupts and squirms without even a thought to what those actions do to you. That is disgustingly horrifying. It's like being eaten by a wild animal, except a bear knows that it's killing you when it bites down on your throat. Does a parasite? The corruption pretty much refers to the nasty. If it's rotten, sticky, decaying, infected, that's corruption. It's interesting, a lot of these entities have a very obvious fear attached, like finding a swarm of insects in the walls of your house or maggots in your food, but there's also sometimes a more metaphorical interpretation. Have you ever been in a relationship that started good but grew into something toxic? Where a happy connection was infected by jealousy or abuse or manipulation? That's corruption in its worst form. Sure, an apple full of bugs is disgusting, but you haven't built a life with your apple. All things are corruptible. All people. Nothing is sacred. Nothing is safe. Everything will be made infested. As humans, the majority of us desperately rely on our eyesight to function. Of course, there are blind or partially blind people who can operate at various levels of independence and adaptation, which is mind-blowing to me, but that doesn't erase the true horror which the dark represents. Sure, it can simply be a dark room which freaks you out, but the true horror of the dark is actually just obscurity. What you imagine will always be scarier than what you can be actively shown. This was a big point of my last video essay, and it still stands. The dark, as a fear, is primal. It's the first one any of us get. It's the extinguished flame, or the unexpected night, or even blindness. While corruption is horrible in one way, and the buried is horrible in another, the dark is horrible in all ways. It preys on your not knowing, on the part of you that wants to understand but can't. It's a beckoning hand from out the shaded alley, an ambiguous shape in the corner of your room. When you look at a friend's face in the dark, what looks back is a bastardization, a shortcut, a dreamy idea of a face. It is absence made present, the unknown made manifest. One of my favorite tricks in horror is forcing the audience member to scare themselves. In my last video, I talked about the idea of the corner, and how not telling someone what's around the corner is potentially scarier than telling them, but now I want to twist that idea a little bit. Instead of a corner, let's talk about actual, physical darkness. Suppose you were asleep in your room in the dead of the night, and were woken up by the sound of your bedroom door closing. That's weird. It was already closed. Why was it opened? Is someone in your room right now? You try to look, but of course it's night. It's dark. There's no way to know in this state. If someone is in your room, you can't tell. That's scary enough on its own, but then you remember the light by the side of your bed. A table lamp or something. Sure, you could reach out and turn the light on and know for sure what's in your room with you, but somehow that feels worse. In this moment, you're experiencing that initial fear we talked about, that what's around the corner fear, but a different kind of dread begins to settle as you move to turn on the light. Whatever's in your room, if anything, hasn't done anything yet. What happens when you turn on the light? Well, you'll see what's in your room. You expose yourself to whatever horror may or may not be there. The resolution of the situation is placed squarely on your shoulders, and neither option is particularly better than the other. Trying to ignore it and going on not knowing, or trying to face it and making the hypothetical a reality, both pose significant threats, so you have to make a decision to know or not. Someone who's really good at this type of horror is Junji Ito, a Japanese horror artist. In most of Ito's work, which tend to be shorter manga stories of cosmic horror, he utilizes this trick of the page turn. Almost always, right before the big reveal of the terror of whichever story, he gives a few panels of other characters reacting to or seeing the terror. They're generally the last panels of that page, which means we as the reader first get to see how scared or upset the terror makes the characters within the story, and then we have to turn the page to see the thing which all the characters are reacting to. Junji Ito is a master artist, capable of designing incredibly strange and intricate horrors, and we know that about him, so every time we do that page turn, we're knowingly moving from the darkness into the light, which is a transition that by itself is more anxiety-inducing than either the revelation or the not knowing. The scariest part is our action in the scene. Is it worse to have terror inflicted upon you by another, or to inflict it upon yourself? Think back to that cave, to those people relying on their light, desperately clinging to it, guarding it, knowing they're surrounded on all sides by that which snuffs out their safety. Who's at fault if that light goes out? Circumstance? The cavers for knowingly putting themselves in that situation? The cave? I don't think it actually matters. The darkness is a threat in any sense because, if that light goes out, that's it. You have people you love, right? If not that, maybe a pet, a lifestyle maybe, a space, something which you cling to which brings you comfort against the horrors of reality. The end is a particularly cruel fear because it's founded on loss, pure and simple. When an old loved one speaks of pain or sickness and your mind flashes to the worst case scenario, it is the end that you're envisioning. The physical pain of sickness, the exhausting nature of hospitals, the threat of genuine and permanent loss, these anxieties are real and unavoidable and all tied to the same undeniable finality of life. If you live long enough, you will experience it, no matter what. You'll experience it even if you don't live very long. That's the scary thing about the end. It's not in any rush. It comes to everyone. One of my favorite philosophical anecdotes is, of course, tied to Diogenes. Diogenes is one of my favorite philosophers because he was just kind of a dick to everyone, but in a smart way. He's the behold a man guy with the plucked chicken. There's this story where Diogenes is approached by Alexander the Great while considering a pile of human bones. When questioned about what he was doing, Diogenes replies, "I'm searching for the bones of your father, but cannot distinguish them from that of a slave." First of all, bars. Get his ass, Diogenes. But second, it's actually a great point Diogenes is making here. Death is, of course, the great equalizer, at least in my opinion. Doesn't matter if you're a king or a peasant, you just die the same. It can almost be uplifting in a way, the idea that those who live so far above your own means, who potentially oppress and look down at you, will always end up in the same place in the end. No one escapes it. But that's making the end about someone else and ignoring that it happens to us too. I don't know how many times I can say it, but the end is for everyone. The worst part of being a human is knowing what happens to us, or rather, knowing what can happen to us. We all know we'll die eventually, and so will the people that we care about. Sure, we can value the time we have with them now, and we can take comfort in the new, but in the back of our minds, we'll always know that the time is limited, that the new will always become the old, and that we're all destined to have things we love ripped away from us in one way or another. Sometimes, the fear of suffering is suffering enough. We all die, but that's not the scary part. The scary part is knowing. The Desolation is quite like the end in that it's about loss, but it strikes in a much more shocking and visceral way. Where the end is about inevitability, something which can't be avoided by the very nature of reality, the Desolation is senseless, random. Let me be clear here that desolation means something very specific. It's personal. When you experience the fear of desolation, it's not the action which you're afraid of, but the effects which are so overwhelmingly horrible. The burning down of a house can be scary in a number of ways. If you're inside the house, it's scary because you could die or feel pain, but that's not the desolation you're feeling. That's probably a version of the end. The desolation is what you'd feel if you were safely outside the house, looking in. The desolation is the ache as you realize that your home, the place full of memories and warmth and safety, is gone. The desolation is the agony of losing someone too young, someone who had so much ahead of them, of watching someone's work or passion or livelihood be ripped away from them senselessly. Desolation is loss. Did you know you appear on about 70 cameras on any given productive day? There are 5 in your coffee shop, maybe 20 or more in your school or workplace, potentially hundreds on the roads you travel every day. In this day and age, it's hard to avoid being seen unless you hide out in your room and don't talk to anyone. Even if you do, though, you might be someone like me, who posts content online, drawing any number of unknown individuals to your name and voice and potentially image. So many people can see you. So many people can judge. So many people can make plans about you and know where you are without your permission. How can you ever truly feel alone? This is what the eye is about. The eye plays a pretty important role in the overall plot of Magnus Archives, a show which is, by all accounts, about observing other people's suffering. It's kind of funny. A lot of the time listening to the show, hearing about the suffering these characters are going through, you wonder what kind of monster could do something like that to a person, could feed off their suffering in such a way. But what are you doing then? When you hungrily start the next episode of the series, curious to hear the next story of terror and mystery, are you not just as guilty as the entities themselves? gorging themselves on tales of pain and misery. What makes you any different? We all have eyes. It should come as no surprise that the flesh is one of my personal least favorites on this list. As you may know, I have a deathly fear of needles, and also a fascination with skeletons. What's the common denominator? Skin bad. The flesh is another one that gets you by being disgusting. It's blood and guts, and the idea of pain as it strictly applies to the warm, soft, mushy bits that make our outer layers. A great way to describe it via genre is body horror. The image of a scalpel, a slaughterhouse of blood. That's all the horror of the flesh. I actually read a great book last year called Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Basterrica, and it encapsulates this fear almost perfectly. The book is about a version of Earth where the consumption of animals is no longer possible, so society converts to a form of industrialized cannibalism. The book is super effective because its main source of horror is the recontextualization of the meat industry from cow and pig-centered to human-centered. The author effectively lays out the actual practices that humans inflict against livestock in the preparation of meat and simply replaces the livestock with humans, forcing us to imagine ourselves in the very real situation that many animals encounter at the end of their lives. It's a book that surely created a lot of vegetarians. As humans, we do a great deal of work to try to distance ourselves from the animal kingdom. We talk about the developed brain, or the soul, or even opposable thumbs, and convince ourselves that we aren't just animals, we're something better and beyond. But the fact of the matter is, if your brain is working the right way, something breaking the skin, tearing the flesh, ripping out the meat and muscle is just as bad for you as it would be for any living creature. I love focusing on the fact that we have a skeleton, because a skeleton is solid, structured, harder to break, but what surrounds that skeleton is a lot of tender meat. We're all made of meat, and that's horrifying. The hunt, conceptually, is one of my favorite fears in the Magnus Archives because it touches on something which I've danced around a bit already in this essay, namely the separation between humans and every other species in the animal kingdom. The cool thing about the hunt is that it's actually one of the only fears on this list that's predicated on the purely non-human experience, at least in a modern era. Humans, right now, mostly, don't have any natural predators. Of course, humans can kill each other and do that all the time, but that's a different form of violence. It's threatening and scary, of course, but not in an instinctual way. Imagine being a rabbit, though. A lot of the fears listed in this video won't apply to a rabbit because it's simply not capable of considering threats in the same way as we do. However, what a rabbit is doing that we aren't is constantly considering its own survival. A rabbit is not strong, it has no venom, it has no claws, it has no armor. It's a prey animal, so at any given time a rabbit has to be constantly aware of its surroundings or it'll die. A rabbit's best defense mechanism is its own speed, the ability to outrun or outmaneuver a pursuing predator, and that's what it does when it considers anything a threat. Before humans came along and drastically changed the state of nature, a rabbit still had this primal instinct, this understanding that the majority of things around it not only can kill it, but most likely will if given the chance. How often can you say that you experience the same thing? When I was younger, I was afraid of dogs, because one time I went to the house of my dad's coworker with him, and while he was doing whatever he was doing, I was left to play alone in the backyard. I was a pretty small kid, especially at the time, so when I started getting chased around the yard by the coworker's excited bulldog, I was terrified. In retrospect, the bulldog wasn't even being that aggressive, it was just doing that thing that dogs do, which is running around and jumping up on people when they're excited, but to me, it was like being chased by a wild animal. I ended up jumping on a bench to try to escape it, but the bench wasn't tall enough, and the dog jumped up and knocked me off of it, and after that, I could barely stand to be around bigger dogs. They seemed like wild animals to me. Now, most of the time, we don't have to worry about wild animals, but sometimes we suddenly do. When you're camping and you hear a howl or the sound of a heavy branch snapping deep in the woods, we're suddenly reminded that for all our technology, all our supposed brain power, we're still at the mercy of the wild. And I'm only talking from my American perspective. We've got coyotes and mountain lions and bears in Colorado, and I've been lucky enough to avoid them on my hikes and camping trips, but in coastal areas, they've got sharks and jellyfish. In Asia, they have the Komodo dragon. In Australia, they've got pretty much any animal that lives in Australia. We've forgotten what it's like to be at the mercy of the strongest creature, and when we're reminded, it's terrible. It's not hard to understand the fear of being alone. Humans are inherently social creatures, and with some exception, require social interaction to function. It's how we move forward as a society. We build our infrastructure together, we make and enforce our rules together, or at least we're supposed to. A big part of loneliness is usually comparative. It's hard to be alone, but it's even harder when you've not been that in the past. A failed relationship, a death, a moving away, these are things which paint our loneliness. The idea of suddenly being all by yourself, of having to rely on your own abilities is threatening enough, but that's ignoring the true terror of being alone, which is having no one to share your experiences with, no one to comfort you when you're sad, no one to take care of you when you're sick, no one to laugh with you when you tell a joke. There's a lot of people on this planet, so many that it seems insane that anyone would have to struggle through life by themselves, and yet it happens. We shun the homeless, move them from place to place, set up hostile architecture so they can't sleep or relax in public spaces, and judge them with disgust when we discover communities of tents or cardboard boxes. We avoid the mentally ill, the emotionally challenged, and the non-conforming, and we cultivate a culture of separation. We tell these people that there is no place for them among us, that they aren't people in the same way that we are, and that they don't deserve human connection. We want them to disappear. I live in Boulder, and there's a real homelessness problem here. The disgusting thing is that when I say homelessness problem, what I mean is that there's a problem with the way we treat the homeless in my city. But when others say homelessness problem, it means they have a problem with the homeless. At my old job, we were open later than most other businesses, and that meant the homeless people came in near the end of the day seeking shelter from awful college kids in the terrible weather. These are people who have so little, who are not assured survival through hard times in the way you and I probably are, and most of the time, management would want us to make them leave. And when you're a bigger guy in a store full of younger women, that job usually goes to you. And that's what I was. Part of my job became corralling homeless people and the mentally ill out of the business. It was soul-crushing. There was a man sleeping by our back door once, bundled up in a jacket, hurting no one, just trying to get some rest beneath the cover of our building. The closing manager that night was a younger woman, and that meant, as usual, that it was my job to make him move. Despite my own frustration with the situation and disagreement with the way things were being handled, I did what I was told. I went out and asked the man to move, told him that employees needed to leave through that door so he shouldn't have been there, and he said something to me that really rocked me. It was simple. Am I actually hurting anyone by being here? And the answer was no. Definitively, without question, no. He wasn't hurting business, he wasn't hurting people, he was just trying to survive a fucked up situation, and it had become my job to make his life harder. I felt like the lowest, most disgusting filth watching that man walk away, knowing that it was my fault, that I had done the thing to him that so many others had, made him less than me. I left that job pretty soon after. I don't mean to make this video depressing or political, but I'm just trying to express the awful way that the lonely infects this world. Sometimes we do it to ourselves, which is hard enough, but when we start doing it to others, we become the monsters. Human empathy shouldn't be dependent on presentation. No one should be made to feel alone if they don't want to be. When you think about war, what's the first thing that comes to mind? A soldier firing a rifle at another soldier from across a bloody battlefield? A bomb going off, leveling a building and killing countless individuals? A drone strike, a landmine, an assassination attempt? It doesn't matter what part of the slaughter you try to focus on or what part of the issue you try to excuse it with. When we go to war, we destroy each other. We maim and kill, and to some there might not be a good reason for it, and to others there might be, but the fact remains that the loss is tremendous for everyone involved. We've talked about the end, which is the fear of inevitable loss, and the desolation, which is the fear of that which we care about being destroyed, and now we reach the slaughter. The slaughter is human, more human than death or loss because it's predicated on violence. It's the choice to inflict pain, to hurt those around you, or to be hurt by them. It's not hard to understand how a fear like this could be cultivated in the modern era. We're subject to constant reporting, especially in America, about terrible tragedies committed against innocents with little done to change it, both nationally and internationally. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but people are capable of doing terrible things to each other, and they always have been. It's scary on a battlefield, but it's even scarier when it reaches our malls and movie theaters and schools. The destruction of life, benefiting no one, hurting everyone. The massacre, the shooting, it's all just thoughtless slaughter. The funny thing about fear is that it presents itself differently to different people. I think most of us would agree that the fears which hit us the hardest are usually based on some experience we had earlier in our lives. That's the way our brain works. It takes in information based on your experiences and decides what is a threat and what isn't based on that. I've talked before about my fear of medical needles, but I wasn't born with that fear. The reality is I had a few traumatic experiences tied to needles starting in 5th grade and moving into probably 7th grade that painted needles as these terrifying, horrible instruments, when in reality it was the whole of the situation itself which was bad, and the needles were just the thing that stuck out to me. Or perhaps into me, haha. But sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes your mind isn't what dictates your fear. Sometimes your mind is your fear. The spiral is a great name for this fear because it kind of refers to how someone reacts to it. When you can't trust yourself or the people around you, when you're worried about being deceived by a third party or worse, your own mind, you begin to fall into a pit of anxiety and paranoia. If you can't trust your own understanding of reality, what can you trust? Imagine a schizophrenic person. Not the wild villainous caricature that Hollywood likes to use, but an actual person dealing with a mental disorder. Schizophrenia, like a lot of disorders, can affect people in different ways and to different degrees. I've met people diagnosed with schizophrenia before, and they're just people like you and me, except they have to deal with something that most people don't. There are treatment options and therapies and a whole bunch of stuff that someone can do to help with their symptoms, which can include stuff like delusions or hallucinations. But in more aggressive cases, which we usually refer to as paranoid schizophrenia, there's generally a loss in the ability to distinguish between what is real and what is not real. The reason I'm making this distinction is because if you have the mental capacity to recognize that you can experience hallucinations, you can deal with that in a certain way. But when that ability fails and you suddenly have no baseline for reality, it's not hard to understand how you could suddenly fall into a deep terror. What is a threat? What isn't? Can you trust anything anyone says to you? How do you know that they're real or what they're saying is what you're hearing? The spiral isn't something that only affects people with mental disorders. It really just gets to anyone who doesn't trust their own reality. Conspiracy theorists, religious folks, scientists, they all have different ways that they try to understand the nature of existence. And because the nature of existence is so subjective and hard to pin down, one can find themselves suddenly concerned by what they're experiencing in their day-to-day life. The spiral is just kind of the fear of existing and figuring out what all of that means. When you were growing up, do you remember all the ways that your parents tried to warn you about threats in the world? The PSAs or the classes which really fixated on stranger danger without going too in-depth about what the actual danger was? It's kind of interesting the way a lot of children learn about serious concepts. We learn to be afraid of them before we learn why. The stranger is a fear which, like a lot of other fears, has ties to multiple entities. There's the inherent fear of the unknown, which comes from not knowing a stranger's intentions, which is a lot like the fear of the dark, or potentially the threat of violence, which can refer to the slaughter or the desolation, but I think trying to separate it from those fears is the most interesting, when the stranger exists by itself. When you see a person, you automatically do a little check to see if that person is a threat to you. If you already know them, that informs a lot, but other things like body language, appearance, and location have a lot to do with whether or not we're afraid of someone. An adult smiling at you in a park is a lot scarier if you don't know them than if it's just your mom watching you play. But every once in a while, your brain reaches a point where it can't decide. The factors which your brain normally uses to decide whether or not something is a threat just don't apply in the same way, and a sense of unease washes over you, not because you think there's a threat, but because in this moment, you've suddenly lost the ability to make that distinction. A great example of this is something called the uncanny valley. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I am a big fan of understanding fear, so hopefully I can explain it correctly. Essentially, when you're looking at something which is meant to resemble something human in some way, there's a kind of scale to how accurately it captures that humanity and how your brain reacts to it. So, seeing an industrial machine, something like the machines that help assemble cars for instance, doesn't trigger anything in your brain because it's so clearly a different thing than a human. However, the closer that machine gets to appearing human while still clearly being something else, the more unsettling it becomes. Things like zombies, animatronics, dolls, and AI all have slightly more upsetting connotations attached to them because there are parts of them which our brain recognizes as human, and yet other parts which it does not. A zombie has the physical appearance of a human, except it's rotting and moving in a way that a human never would. An AI voiceover can mimic human language and say things which your brain understands, but the cadence of the speech is generally so unnatural that your brain knows it's not hearing an actual person talking. The point is, as mentioned earlier, humans are social creatures, but we also have these primal guidelines which help inform us of threats. When someone tries to obscure the things which help us decide, like hiding their face or unnaturally changing their tone, we get uncomfortable, and suddenly stranger danger is a real thing again, because what are they hiding? It's definitely terrifying to be surrounded on all sides, enclosed in a place you absolutely can't escape, but it's also terrifying not to be able to escape somewhere because it's so huge. Imagine being lost at sea, stuck in some life raft in the middle of nowhere, ocean on all sides. Sure, you can move around, you're not restricted, really, but what are you gonna do? Where are you gonna go? There's no land anywhere, it feels almost infinite. What decisions can you make when trapped in an endless sea of nothingness? What if something's below you? A shark or a sea monster or any number of unknown creatures, how would you escape? A lot of the fears on this list are so powerful because they prey on your inability to do anything about them. You can't stop the end, you can't reason with the corruption, and in this case, you can't fill the vast. Another big part of the vast as a fear is the fear of heights. It's strange to be afraid of spaces because they're so ambiguous and arguably more conceptual than physical. A fear of heights is not being afraid of the large distance between you and the ground, really, just like the fear of being lost at sea isn't really the same as being afraid of the ocean. You're not afraid of the water or gravity, you're afraid of your own helplessness to them. Falling from a tremendous height has no real solution unless you happen to have a parachute, and being lost at sea has no real solution unless you're rescued. It's a fear that makes you feel small by making the things around you so big. Why do you think so many people are afraid of spiders? There are so many different species of bug on our planet, and yet people really tend to dislike spiders specifically, including me. It can't be a leg thing because what about centipedes or millipedes? Maybe it's a venom thing, but plenty of other species have venom, not even just bugs. So what is the thing that makes spiders so iconically terrifying? Well, it's the web. This elegant, fragile crisscrossing of a strange wispy substance which appears wherever most spiders are. Sometimes we see a web with nothing in it, and even that is enough to freak us out because we know that there's a spider around. A web is a trap, inherently. It's a way for spiders to hunt their prey, and if you know anything about how that entire process works, it's unsettling. And if you don't, you're about to. First of all, let me acknowledge that 1, not all spider webs work the same way, and 2, not all spiders hunt using webs. But for the sake of this video, I'll talk very generally about my understanding of the process. Spider webs are almost invisible to the insects they're supposed to trap, because they're essentially transparent in the wavelength of light that most flying insects use. What this means is that to most smaller flying insects, the threat of a spider web is almost impossible to avoid. If you hit it and you're not big enough or moving fast enough, you're almost certainly doomed. When a fly gets trapped in a spider's web, it'll start to struggle, and through that struggle, it'll send vibrations up the web to the spider. When the spider reaches them, generally, it'll start by wrapping up their prey in more webbing before biting their prey and injecting it with venom. The venom paralyzes the fly and starts liquefying its insides, which the spider then slurps up from beneath the exoskeleton. That's so fucking terrifying that if this was the only reason the web was a fear on this list, I would totally understand. What other creature is so blatantly deceptive and horrible in its hunting? But the fact is, while an actual fear of spiders definitely falls under the category of the web can also refer to any instance when someone finds themselves suddenly controlled or trapped, just like the fly in the web. I think the scariest part of being trapped in a spider's web is the brief moment before the spider arrives when you realize the nature of your situation. When you wake up one day and realize you're stuck in a situation you didn't see coming, when you're forced to do something against your will, or something is done to you without any way to fight back. The web is another fear which preys on your helplessness. Finally, we reached the last fear, a fear which in the Magnus Archives kind of separates itself from the other fears. It's a newer one which we've managed to form fully on our own. It's the fear of extinction, of a dramatic and permanent ending on a large scale. This fear truthfully does encapsulate all of the other fears at once because of its totality. As humanity has gotten further and further along in its evolution, we've changed the planet more and more. The Industrial Revolution was the beginning of an era that has never been seen before and expanded so rapidly that there was no telling how it would end. Well, we're living on a planet now that's consistently struggling with the effects of carbon emissions, global warmings, overcrowding, and rising sea levels. We're not just worried about dying individually anymore, we're worried about losing everything. We're worried about nuclear annihilation, or the diseases which will start appearing more and more as temperatures rise, or that eventually we'll run out of clean water or healthy soil. These aren't just individual fears anymore, they're the coalescence of most of our fears at once. That we can do nothing about it, that we're being lied to about it, that it's being intentionally done, or that we'll be left behind to suffer through it. Every time someone talks about saving the planet, they're talking about the extinction. The final fear, the one that ends all others, even the fear of the end. Because no one is left, death isn't scary anymore, it isn't even a thing anymore. Extinction is the end of all things, and that is arguably the most terrifying. So, there you have it. 15 terrible fears to fixate on your whole life and make you suffer forever. Everything is terrible and life is horrifying. Except, this is a video about the Magnus Archives, and to end it without referencing the things which make life so beautiful is missing the point of the show. Sure, it's primarily about the horrors which exist all around us, but it's also about people. The lonely is only a threat when you're alone, the stranger is scary when you're by yourself, but people, those you love and those who love you, are the antidotes. Fear and danger are two different things. Being in danger is always bad, even if you have people around to help you, but fears have no control over you if you make the decision to fight them. That's what Magnus Archives is about. Jonathan Sims is a lonely and jaded person until he finally starts trusting the people around him, as difficult as that is. He experiences pain and loss regardless, but what he feels about Sasha and Tim motivates him to try harder and be smarter. Elias manipulates people around John because he knows if they work together, they'd be that much more of a threat to the terrible forces around them. John and Martin are able to accomplish what they do because they have each other. Even under the worst circumstances imaginable, they persevere, not out of fear or hate or pain, but out of love. A tragic, heartbreaking love, but love all the same. So if you've learned anything from this video, I hope that it's this. You're not defined by your fears. You don't have to be controlled by them. So many parts of this world are meant to drag you down and make you a victim, but so many other parts can build you up and make you infinitely stronger than your opponents. You have to face your fears, because the alternative is too horrifying to imagine. Statement ends. Oh, sorry. I didn't see you there. I was too busy editing this video. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, it would really help if you liked and subscribed if you're not subscribed already. I'm working on growing this channel right now, and it's happening. It's starting to happen slowly, and I really appreciate that, but anything helps. Before things end, I have a few quick things that I wanted to talk about. First, some shout-outs. The first shout out I want to give is to the game dev team behind I Did Not Buy This Ticket, which is an indie game on Steam that the dev, who I want to say is named Tiago, I don't know how to pronounce that name, but I think it's probably that. He sent it to me for free after seeing my quiet horror essay, and that meant so much to me. I decided to play it that night, and it turned out to be a super awesome experience. I ended up interviewing both the dev and the artist for the game, and I think I'll make a larger video about that at some point in the future. It'll be shorter than this one, please. But otherwise, I just wanted to give them a quick shout out and say, hey, this is a great game. Thank you so much for sending it to me. It really means a lot. And if any of you are interested in playing it, I'll put a link to the Steam page in the description. It's short, it's a visual novel, and it's a really interesting topic. The design is really cool, and a lot of other stuff. I think if you liked my quiet horror video, you'll probably really like this, so definitely give it a check out, and thank you once again to the team behind that game. It means a lot to me to have that kind of support. Another shout out that I wanted to do really quickly is my mom and dad. I used their likeness a lot in my quiet horror video, and then my mom said, my mom noticed that, and I used their likeness a lot in this video too, so I thought this was a good moment to say, hey Mom and Dad, thank you. I really appreciate your help. They've been great. They don't tend to know what I'm talking about because my interests are pretty different from theirs, but they have been great about watching my content and sharing it with their friends who also don't know what I'm talking about. So once again, thank you guys. I really appreciate that. Another quick announcement is that I now have a members option on this channel. If you want to become a member, you'll get access to a specific members only Discord, which is going to be the best place to talk to me. If you have collaboration ideas, if you have fan art, if you have any other kind of stuff that you want to get my way, that'll be the best place to get to me. And it's a fun community, hopefully. No one's joined yet, but we'll see. Another shout out to my buddy Christian. He is going to end up being the moderator on that Discord. He's a lot more technically proficient with computer shit and all that kind of stuff, so it's a big help that he'll be doing that. So he's also really nice, and you'll get to talk to him if you join the members thing. So go ahead and do that if you would like. Last thing I wanted to say is that I also make music. It's the music that you tend to hear in the background of these video essays, and it's available on Apple Music or Spotify or any of those great places under the name of Bosch. I stole it from one of my favorite artists, Johannes Bosch. Hopefully you all know who that is. The majority of my music that I've been releasing recently has been D&D soundtrack stuff. I'm also a DM, and I write specific music for my campaigns and the characters within them. One thing I wanted to say is, if you happen to listen to any of that music and you like it and you think it would serve your own D&D story well, or something like a game or your own video essay, you have absolute, you are allowed to use it. If you ever get in trouble for that, like if some kind of online system says, hey, you're stealing something copyrighted, you can reach out to me. You can use my Instagram or any of these great places, and I will do everything in my power to make that available for you. I'm a big fan of sharing all of my creativity, and so if you happen to like that, go ahead and use it. And if you just want to give it a listen just for fun, that also means a lot to me. It's more of a hobby than anything, but I like doing that kind of stuff, and I wanted to share it here. Yeah. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of the views and the new subscribers recently. We hit 3,500 at some point yesterday, and that is awesome. That's really cool. So I hope you liked this video. If you did, like and subscribe, share it with people, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.